All right, so good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for the Procurement and Trade Compliance SARM Group Buying Program webinar. My name is Adam Broham, and I'm an Administrative Coordinator with SARM. We're going to start off today's webinar with a brief intro to the Adobe Connect platform. We will then transition into the main presentation, followed by a Q&A session. Please note that today's webinar will be recorded, and a copy of that webinar will be available on our website under the webinars page following today's presentation. Okay, so if you're ever experiencing any issues with your audio or video, please refer to the drop-down menus located on the top toolbar for additional assistance. Sometimes closing out of the session completely and rejoining helps as well. Please also note that if you are joining us through your internet browser, Google Chrome tends to work best with the Adobe Connect platform. We recommend downloading the Adobe Connect desktop app if you are experiencing any issues with your audio or video, as it tends to offer a better experience. There's a chat box located on the right side of your webinar window that can be seen by all webinar participants. You can use this to engage with other attendees, bring any technical difficulties to the speaker's attention for troubleshooting, or to provide any other comments and feedback. Please note that there is a dedicated question and answer box labeled Submit Questions here, where you can submit any questions that you may have throughout today's webinar. Please do not submit any questions through the chat box. There will also be a copy of today's presentation available for download during the Q&A portion of the session next to the chat box. Please let me know in the chat if you are unable to download that file, and I will email it to you directly. And again, if you're experiencing any technical issues during today's event, please notify us in the chat box and we will do our best to troubleshoot. So I will now hand it over to Amanda Kozak, SARM's Trading Services Advisor, who will be moderating today's session.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. I'd like to start off today by introducing Ainsley Murdock, who is our Client Relations Manager here at SARM. Our group buying program is a powerful tool that helps municipalities save time and money with everyday purchases by combining forces. Group buying allows municipalities access to a wide range of industry standard products and services and receive preferred membership pricing. This is a free service available to all SARM members. SARM ensures that the procurement of products and services made available to the members meets the requirements of the New West Trade Partnership Agreement and the Canadian Free Trade Agreement. We participate in the process by advertising on the Sask Tenders website. I'd now like to hand it over to Ainsley.
Great, thanks for the introduction, Amanda, and hopefully everyone can hear me okay. As noted, my name is Ainsley Murdock, and I'm the Client Relations Manager with SARM Trading Services. So my role as Client Relations Manager is just to assist SARM members in all their procurement requirements. So I can work with your team to help source out equipment you might be looking for, help you obtain membership pricing, maximize supplier discounts and benefits, and connect you with your local sales reps. So feel free to reach out to me at any time with any questions you may have, or to schedule a conference call or a meeting with your team so we can review your unique procurement requirements together, and I can outline how to maximize key benefits of the program. So in today's webinar, we are going to outline how we are trade compliant with CFTA and NWPTA, how we go to tender on members' behalf, and answer common related procurement related questions. So joining me on today's call is Raman, Khabra, General Counsel, and Dave Dextraze is also on the call as a backup too, and he'll be providing support. He's the Vendor Relations Manager, and they'll both be facilitating this webinar. So Raman, I'll pass it over to you now.
Thanks, Ainsley. Can everyone hear me okay? Okay, looking for you, Ainsley. Excellent. As Ainsley mentioned, I'm Raman Khabra. I'm General Counsel at RMA, one of SARM's partners with respect to the trade operations. Today, what I'm going to be providing is just a legal and procurement update. And what we're going to be focusing on today is the national legislation, but I want to touch on a couple of local pieces just so that you're aware and that your municipalities are understanding what the compliance rules are. So when we're looking, why we're looking at the federal legislation is just simply because of our reach. We have partnerships across the country, and that allows us quite a bit of buying power on behalf of the municipalities that we represent. Now, when we're looking at domestic trade in Canada, it is governed at various levels. So there'll be local legislation, such as directives or policies within your municipalities that would provide guidance to municipalities on how to operate. There are regional agreements that set out various partnerships that seek to remove barriers to trade. The most relevant one for your interest would be the NWPTA. And then there's the national agreement, which is the Canadian Free Trade Agreement. It's important to understand that these agreements overlap at the national and regional levels across Canada. So when you're engaging in procurement, it's important to keep in mind and that you could keep in mind the various levels and ensure that you're complying within the different directives and policies that are noted within this legislation. Given following challenges and those sorts of things, these pieces of legislation continue to evolve. So it's important to keep that in mind and sort of keep up to date with any sort of new developments. Now, the Agreement on Internal Trade was the first pan-Canadian agreement seeking to eliminate barriers for the movement of goods and services. It was great in theory, but in practice, it wasn't being utilized. So as of July 1st, 2017, the Canadian Free Trade Agreement replaced the Agreement on Internal Trade and is no longer in effect. So the CFTA picked off where the AIT left off. It brings Canadian jurisdictions in line with provisions that are similar to the regional agreements that we were seeing, the more modernized agreements, such as the NWPTA. Building upon its predecessor, the CFTA establishes a more clear and comprehensive modern framework for internal trade within Canada. And it, really opened up the sectors that would be involved and that would be exposed to free trade on a national level. So the goal of the federal legislation is to make it easier for businesses, investors, municipalities to have, increased access to Canadian markets and achieve greater value from procurement. So another thing about the Canadian Free Trade Agreement is that the signatories are the federal government, the provinces, and the territories. So your local province in Saskatchewan would be the party to the CFTA, and that's the party that's responsible to ensure compliance with this piece of legislation. So when we're looking at the CFTA, in 2017, it was a big deal. Parties were interested about, what's going to change. And really what happened when it came into effect is an expansion of regional trends, of transparency and non-discrimination to the rest of the country. So many of the changes that we see in this piece of legislation are also aligned with CETA, which is the Canadian-European Trade Agreement, and other international treaties. So it's trying to keep the provisions in line so that there's not a number of different procedures that local governments would need to follow. Now, as I mentioned, the Agreement on Internal Trade had a lot of problems, one of which was that it didn't regulate vast sectors of the Canadian economy. So there's been an expansion to that within the CFTA. Also, there's more agreement on the goals from the party, right? So there's been more commitment from the jurisdictions in enforcing this legislation. The CFTA is a bit more rigid and specific in its approach in how it's worded. With respect to dispute resolution, the CFTA is putting more positive requirements on provinces to ensure that there's enforcement and that there's enforcement bodies in place. So that's something that's changed as well. And also, this is the first time that in a national piece of legislation where buying groups and group purchasing has been explicitly noted. So that's something that was quite significant for RMA and SARM when looking at the services that we provide to our members. Now, what the CFTA does is it sets rules for government procurement for the MASH sector, as well as for provincial and federal bodies. And for the municipal realm, the valuations requiring compliance with the procurement rules are $105,700 for goods and services, and $264,200 for construction. Although those thresholds may seem high for sort of one-off purchases, when you're looking at it now, you need to include taxes, fees, extras, as well as optional renewal terms within the contract in valuating those threshold amounts. So you're not simply looking at the term for which a commitment is initially made. You need to consider, the optional years and all these other taxes, fees, etc., when considering whether you're meeting that threshold. So under the CFTA, it's a lot easier to hit those threshold amounts. Now, what's happening when we're talking about the rules for government procurement, we're talking about rules for procurement for a government purpose of a good or service that's not intended to be resold by any contractual means, which includes purchase, leases, rentals, with or without the option to buy. So that's what we're looking at when we're considering valuation. The numbers for the valuation amounts for threshold, they vary every 2 years, I believe. They're adjusted. So over the last 4 years, we've seen that value amount increase. So we're also looking at total procurement value. So for SARM, we're not looking at each individual member's procurement value. We're looking at us as a group. And so it's quite easy we just assume when conducting any sort of open procurement that we're going to be hitting those threshold amounts. And so we, in our processes, engage that open procurement process for all of our tenders. And there's a note here on positive obligations on buying groups. So that's something that, I want to note. In the past, on the regional side, the language regarding municipal purchasing or group procurement was very permissive. And now the Canadian Free Trade Agreement sets out new provisions that expressly clarify buying group procedures. So these are procedures that are binding on SARM and on RMA in conducting procurements, and rules that we need to follow, as well as the municipalities that we represent. So when we're talking about a buying group, we're talking about a group of 2 or more members that combines the purchasing requirements and activities of the members of the group into one joint procurement process. So this can include cooperative arrangements where individual members are administering the procurement function, or more formal arrangements in which the buying group is administering the procurement for its group members. And that's what SARM is doing on behalf of its members. So buying groups can consist of a variety of entities. So it can be private sector entities, not-for-profit entities. So you have to keep that in mind as well when considering valuation. You're considering it on behalf of this group, even if it's not specifically within the MASH sector. So, as a bottom line, as independent organizations, much of the type of procurement activities that SARM is doing and RMA is doing, we're considered buying groups for the purpose of this legislation. So when we're talking about the rules that SARM needs to follow in representing its members, there are a number of positive obligations, and we're just going to go through some of them. So a procuring entity, that being a municipality shall ensure that any procurement conducted through a buying group is carried out in a manner consistent with the general procurement rules of government procurement. So that's an obligation on municipalities to ensure and do its due diligence that when purchasing through a buying group, that there is this, compliance with general procurement rules. Now, when you are participating with a buying group, a buying group is required to publish a notice for each procurement. The notice there needs to list participating procuring entities and also outline the potential for other procuring entities to participate in the procurement after the procurement instrument has been put in place. So you'll see language in our RFPs that note current members and potential future members, as well as a listing of current members of SARM. A procuring entity shall publish a notice of its participation with the buying group at least annually on one of the tendering websites or systems designated by its province. So this notice is intended to direct potential vendors to the buying group tender notices website, if it's at all different from, local websites for the municipality. So the system that's designated by the province of Saskatchewan is Sask Tenders. I know that there's been a little bit of inconsistent advice with respect to this publishing the notice of intention. So that's something that SARM is working with the government of Saskatchewan on just clarifying that advice, because there was some indication that SARM could post on behalf of its members this notice of intention. We are getting clarity on that, so just hang tight. But for the purpose of this presentation, I'm going to just stick consistent with the language of the legislation, which is requiring municipalities to post their own notice of intention. So I have some text here that you likely have seen before from SARM. And this is an example of the type of notice of intention that is required to be posted when participating in SARM's buying group. And again, this is something that once we have some clarity on, Catherine and Amanda will definitely be passing this information along as to the instructions that we've received from the province with respect to these notices of intention. And I also want to note that as organizations and as buying groups, we post our own similar notices of intention as well. So you'll see often on SARM, if you're looking at SaaS tenders, SARM will post a notice of intention to participate in RMA's processes, as well as, partnership with Sourcewell, which is another buying group that we're partnered with. So that's something that we're doing to ensure that there's notice out there to vendors and suppliers to keep an eye out for opportunities that are being posted by these groups. Now, there's also this interesting text with respect to buying groups, and it notes that where a procuring entity has little or no control over the procurement process, it's not required to ensure that the procurement is consistent with this chapter. So that contradicts a bit with the legislation that the earlier piece that we noted that it's a procuring entity's obligation to ensure that the buying group is being consistent, but where it has little control over it, here it's noting that it's not. So we always say it's important to do your own due diligence, be comfortable with the processes and the legislation and your group processes, and hopefully, today's presentation will help support, SARM's operations and your ability to use SARM as a buying group. Now, when we're talking about the rules that municipalities and buying groups need to follow, they're the same rules. It's the same themes that we see in all trade legislation. It's open, transparent, and non-discriminatory access to covered procurement by its procuring entities. So when we're looking at that, we're looking at no favoritism. which is treatment that's no less favorable than the best treatment that the party accords to its own local goods and services and to suppliers. No avoidance. And what that means is, preparing or designing and structuring a procurement or selecting a valuation method that in a way that's to avoid the obligations of the CFTA. And so that's why I wanted to really point out the valuation methods and how that's changed. Oftentimes, with a one-off purchase that falls under that threshold amount, we're not looking at some of those optional terms. And there's been more of a desire to use local suppliers, but you want to be careful that you're not avoiding the requirements here in the CFTA. So dividing quantity of goods or services that are being procured is another example of avoidance. And another is no circumventing. So, no using options or canceling procurement or modifying an awarded contract to circumvent the obligations of the CFTA. I do want to note that there are certain procurements that are exempted from the rules of the free trade legislation. So anything with respect to forms of assistance, being grants, loans, guarantees, fiscal incentives, as well as acquisition or rental of land, that's excluded as well. Services related to financial matters, so any sort of procurement of financial services regarding the management of financial assets or liabilities. These are all procured, are all exempted procurements, as well as health and sciences, etc. But I also want to note that there are certain exceptions that are regionally based. So, when you're looking at this, make sure you take a look at the schedules because there are specific exceptions for each province as well. Now, when we're looking at the tender notice or RFP, as we often refer to it, these are the requirements that we're required to include. So, of course, the name and address of the procuring entity, description of the procurement, the nature and quantity of the goods and services to be procured, any sort of conditions for participation. Evaluation criteria is very key. So that includes methods of weighing when you're doing an evaluation, any sort of supplier requirements. If there's technical specifications, they need to be set out as well. And it's important to note that the legislation is clear that technical specifications should not be used to obstruct trade. So when you're looking at that, you want to look at it in terms of performance and function rather than a specific design or characteristics. So a question's come up in the past about preference for a brand. That would be something that would be circumventing trade obligations if you're putting sort of a weighted preference for a specific brand. The deadline for providing RFPs, the CFTA requires that it be a reasonable amount of time. So that depends on the needs and depends on the specific goods or services that are being procured. Under the European trade legislation, the threshold is higher, but again, RMA and SARM assume, given the breadth of our partnerships, that we're going to hit those threshold amounts. So there's a minimum amount of time prescribed in the legislation to keep RFPs open as well. Negotiation allowance. So if there's going to be an allowance for negotiation with suppliers, it needs to be stipulated in the tender notice. Or alternatively, if there's no clear advantageous tender, then there's an ability to allow for negotiation. And a list of participants and potential for expanded procurement. We went over that just a little bit earlier. So what we do as a buying group is list the procuring entities that are members of SARM, and then also note the potential for future additions within the region. Now, when we're talking about, no preference for local service providers, really, the CFTA does allow parties, requiring a local agent or a local address for service. You can also require posting a bond or any sort of form of financial security, in the event that there's concerns about, an entity or a vendor from outside of the province and being able to ensure that obligations are being met. So, you can request a specific type of insurance or guarantee and that sort of thing. Now, for modifications, clarification and new information, all suppliers, need to be informed. So if there's going to be a modification or there's been a question and there's a response that's going to affect how potentially all vendors would see specific wording, it's advantageous and it's required to post, an addendum or something along those lines so that it's clear and fair to anyone who might be interested. So, as noted here, publication of the modification needs to be done. If it's a major modification, at times, it's appropriate to reissue the tender notice. And if it's appropriate with any sort of modification, extending the dates for submission, that needs to be communicated as well. Now, time periods, we talked about that. Under the Canadian Free Trade Agreement, they refer to a reasonable time period, which can vary from different types of procurement. So what you're looking at there is the nature and complexity of the procurement, the extent of subcontracting that might be anticipated, as well as time for transmitting tender documentation by non-electronic means. Now, we've started to specify in our documents the requirement that submissions be made by non-electronic means. But if you are putting something out there and that's not specified, then you want to allow for that opportunity for for mail or parties coming in to drop off their submissions. And then we talked about negotiations. They need to, any sort of intention to negotiate needs to be noted within the RFP. We talked about whether or not, if there's no tender that's obviously advantageous, negotiations are permitted in that instance. When eliminations are being conducted, they need to be done in accordance with criteria. So, you have to decide whether it's going to be concurrent or consecutive eliminations, and just keeping in mind that when you're negotiating, that no unfairness and no discrimination needs to apply as well. Now, standing offers, this is the process that we use almost exclusively. And when you're preparing a procurement that's going to end up in a standing offer, it needs to be noted within the competitive process that's the arrangement that's going to be made. So the clear point there is there needs to be a clear description of how any sort of call-ups or orders will be made under the standing offers. So what we typically do is we note that that's at the discretion of members or potential members. The reason for that is we don't guarantee any sort of value or any sort of procurement amount for our vendors. Of course, like I mentioned, we have an assumption that we're going to hit threshold amounts given our the size of our program, but we definitely don't make any sort of promises in that respect. So that's what we know with respect to standing offers, and that's why that allows us the ability to have, on certain occasions, a number of different standing offers that are available that might be more convenient for our members. Limited tendering. So this is also often referred to as sole sourcing or direct sourcing. Now, the legislation allows for limited tendering, but it's really only in certain circumstances. So it can be when no one submits a tender in response to the open procurement, or if there's unforeseen or emergency circumstances. So one instance that we saw with one of our members was a cyber breach, and just the need there for speed and response time. They were able to conduct sort of a sole source or limited tendering situation. There's also a specific limited tendering exception for IT procurements. So that'll permit limited tendering for additional goods and services that may not have been included in the initial procurement. And that's just acknowledging where a change in supplier, for economic or technical reasons might not be reasonable, and it would just cause significant inconvenience or duplication of costs for the procuring entity. So that's one of the instances that we're seeing limited tendering to be permitted. And instances of collusion. So that's a new exception as well. So if bids within a procurement process are collusive, a procuring entity may choose to engage in a direct award. And again, exceptions can vary from region to region. That includes, limited tendering situations. So, I definitely encourage you to check the applicable schedules if you're engaging in procurement process on your own. But other than that, as a buying group, we will post a notice for each procurement. Now, for awards, tenders need to be awarded within 72 days of the closing date. You want to ensure that there's compliance with essential requirements and conditions. So in evaluation criteria, it's really important to know what pieces are essential, because if something that's noted as essential is omitted, that would be an automatic disqualification. So you want to be careful with what you're noting as your essential requirements and conditions. You're required to select the most advantageous tender, of course, unless it's in the public interest. So, if there's, criminal association or something along those lines, you're allowed to make that exclusion. There's also a piece in the legislation that allows you to verify any sort of abnormally low tenders. So where you're evaluating strictly on price, there's always a concern that, there'll be vendors that are submitting, really low tender amounts and then later raise those values. So if there is something that's abnormally low, you are absolutely permitted to verify that. And that is something that we do in our processes as well. Now, with awards, transparency is key. We're required to promptly inform of our decision and provide those decisions and reasons in writing if they're requested. Award information needs to be published. And if parties are requesting reasons for the selection, you need to be able to provide that, as well as provide vendor debriefs if requested. So that's something that's a new requirement under the CFTA. It helps with that transparency requirement. And that's why it's very important to consider your evaluation criteria and how it's being followed. Here are some examples of actions that are considered inconsistent. So the first is a preference for local goods, services, or suppliers. Scheduling events in the tendering process to prevent certain suppliers from submitting tenders. So that would be relevant within, certain vendors have specific seasons that are very busy. So scheduling a tendering process to avoid and prevent other suppliers from participating is inconsistent with the Act. Price discounts or preferential margins in order to favor particular suppliers. There was a question that came up in a previous presentation. Something as buying groups that we do is we note in our evaluation criteria that in certain instances, having a discount price from our vendors works better with certain procurements, and especially where there's commodity pricing changing. So this is not what that's referring to. This is referring to providing a specific discount or an edge towards one specific supplier. Limiting participation, it's interesting that this legislation notes that you can't limit participation to suppliers that have previously been awarded one or more contracts. So in the past, that's what officials were seeing, was that there was this requirement that you, as a vendor, had participated in procurement or had existing contracts with a municipality, and so that's inconsistent with the legislation as well. Now, prior experience, that's a strange one. If it's not essential to meet the requirements of the procurement, then you can't require the prior experience. Of course, with certain service industries, you're going to require that prior experience and require references, but this is with respect to those types of procurements that it doesn't really matter whether a party's had prior experience or not. Providing information to one supplier in order to give that supplier an advantage over other suppliers, that's obviously inconsistent. Any sort of information once a procurement is open, you need to be providing that through publishing any sort of modifications or any sort of responses to questions that, again, might be relevant to all vendors. And creating unnecessary obstacles for participation is another inconsistent action. Now, there's potential for change here. Oh, just 1 second here. Let me back up. There's we mentioned limited tendering or selection of awards, in the interest of in the interest of the public. There are some exceptions that are exclusions that are permitted. So, if a vendor has bankruptcy or insolvency issues, any sort of false declarations that are being made, or persistent deficiencies in performance under a prior contract, serious crimes, those are things that you can absolutely consider when deciding on awarding a contract. Now, when I'm noting potential for change. So the CFTA requires that provinces engage in exploratory discussions and negotiations that may include incorporating these rules to other industries. These discussions haven't taken place to date, but there is potential for, consideration for including financial services within these within the rules. So it's important to keep that in mind. That's absolutely still up in the air. But we definitely, at SARM and our RMA have regular contact with the provincial government and the authorities here to ensure that we're included in these discussions. So we absolutely will notify our members accordingly when there are any such changes. The roster of panelists, that refers to enforcement, and that's something that we're seeing, slowly being established. Right now, for enforcement, most provinces are continuing to use the rules under the former Agreement on Internal Trade, so there's absolutely going to be changes there. The Government of Canada is required to develop an SPA, so that's a single point of access where vendors can obtain opportunities across the country. Right now, there's a number of provincial bodies that regulate it. So there's Sask Tenders for Saskatchewan. In Alberta, it's APC. This is something that is taking place right now. There are working groups in place working on how this single point of access is going to be established. What we're hearing right now is that your local portals will remain, and that there's going to be an ability to port tender notices that hit that, increased threshold under CETA to go within this single point of access. So opportunities up, above a certain threshold will be automatically fed within the single point of access. And we're hoping that ends up being the process, that's the way that it's looking, given how onerous it is for municipalities and government bodies to post on various procurement websites. So that's something to keep an eye out for. And of course, changes in government and policy, that always allows for a potential for change. You know, in Alberta, we saw a lot of the exceptions, the schedules to this agreement being lifted to promote more investment and national trade. So you know, it really depends. And experience, you know, as we see challenges, you know, the legislation and the interpretation of the legislation might be up for change. And that's something that we absolutely keep an eye on as well. So, you know, in terms of tips, let me just go back to this one here. I always note, don't assume that your current practices are being trade compliant. When you're looking at threshold levels, regional agreements tend to have lower threshold amounts for when they're evaluating procurement. So it's important, and I always recommend sticking to lower threshold amounts when considering whether to consider an open procurement or not. It's just safer given that there's differences in threshold amounts and valuations across the legislation. Use caution when using any of the exceptions. And what I mean by that is ensure that the exception actually applies. There's a lot of assumptions in this area just based on previous practice. And so, I always note taking a look at the legislation and the schedules if you are conducting an open procurement. Use caution when developing any sort of conditions for participation. And when doing that, keep in mind the no favoritism and non-discrimination provisions of the legislation. And contract negotiations is something that absolutely, if that's desired, it needs to be specified in the procurement documentation. So, of course, there's a lot to consider and a lot to do. It's very time and resource consuming, keeping up to date on this. So this is something that we look at on your behalf. So what we do within our group is review trade legislation and guides across Canada. We regularly meet with officials to review our procedures and processes. And as a result of the meetings and feedback that we receive over time, we continuously update our RFP templates and our contracts to ensure that they're not open for challenge, so that our members can have confidence in using our programs. And as we noted earlier, our reach is very significant. And so with that, there's added responsibility. We've had to adapt our processes significantly over the last 4 years to respond to the various changes within our group as well. We've had an external in-depth comparison of relevant provisions across the country that would impact our program so that we could accommodate that growth. And so that I have a binder in my office that kind of looks at the different regions and threshold amounts and requirements. So we as we continue to grow, continue to update our templates to accommodate that as well. And it's definitely, if you're looking at our agreements or our templates, they are definitely more onerous, but we think that's necessary to remove ambiguity and stay in line within the rules of municipal procurement. So growth is one of our main factors that go into our revisions. It's absolutely a balance to ensure compliance while you're still trying to ensure access to the markets for the vendors. Environment plays a role as well. Like I mentioned, changes in government can do that. We've seen most governments working to reduce barriers to internal trade over the past few years. And now there's a little bit of pullback on some of those commitments that we're hearing, in the face of the pandemic and downturn in the economy. But, Back in September, there was a meeting of senior officials across the country, and that did affirm the parties' commitment to this reduction in barriers. So, this process is going to continue to gain steam. At that time in the meeting in September, they also noted the importance of a healthy regulatory environment as being a significant part of our economic recovery. So, open trade process is going to help. When we're looking at our processes, as I mentioned, we attempt to remove ambiguity in our documents and our evaluation processes so that our members are protected from challenge. So, what we're moving towards absolutely is more stringent language in our documents, and especially with our evaluation criteria, it's quite strict, but it is very valuable. Last year, in Alberta, we received a challenge to Service Alberta regarding some of our procurement practices, and we were able to respond very quickly and easily with our documents to confirm that we were committed to an open process. We followed the rules that are required in this industry, and the complaint didn't proceed to the next stage. So that's why it's really important. We anticipate more challenges as we continue to grow as well. And, as the environment's responding to economic realities. So, if you're hearing from, disgruntled vendors or, other interested parties, with respect to the way our process is undertaken, feel free to reach out to Ainsley, reach out to Amanda, and hopefully you can get some assurances that way, because we want to continue to respond in a way that, continues to educate our members as well as the vendors in our regions with respect to why we're doing things the way that we do. So just with respect to the challenges that we see, our program is voluntary. So because of that, we're seeing sort of unsuccessful vendors going directly to members, trying to circumvent the procurement rules, trying to engage in sort of one-off procurements below threshold amounts. And again, just please bring that to us so we can continue to educate on the importance of compliance. When we're looking at education, our staff in various provinces are doing a great job. You've probably heard from them. You've probably heard a number of the points that I've raised here today with respect to the rules and advantages and risks associated with certain processes. And so they can always assist with that. We always tackle issues with a team approach. We work closely with the representatives at SARM. So, it's really important for us to educate the various levels just to create confidence in our program. Oftentimes that education extends to the provincial level and provincial authorities with respect to this legislation, because it is quite new. And, there's a lot to process with respect to trade legislation. So that's something that we absolutely work on. Secure contracts. We're really confident in our processes and the benefits of our programs. So when we've seen past challenges, our processes just spoke for themselves. That continues to create confidence as well. Our contracts are now more secure, which provides security to our members and vendors alike. And at the end of the day, our position is that strong processes result in strong relationships. We continue to make changes. I'm sure there's going to be more changes as we continue to evolve as organizations. And although some of the steps that we take may seem insignificant or tedious, it is necessary. And as municipalities, it's important to know that, these are the steps that are required of you. And we understand that they're time and resource consuming. So we want to do what we can to support our members in accessing the market and managing compliance as well. That's a huge part of that. So just another repeat slide on our reach. But I hope that this has been helpful. Of course, if you have any questions, feel free to submit that within that question box, and I'll try my best to answer them. And Dave is also on the line, and he may provide some insight as well. Thank you.
Hi, Raman. I have some questions that I commonly get from members. If I could ask a couple.
Absolutely.
Yep. Okay. Just wanted to make sure I was unmuted. When you're talking about the thresholds of, like, 75,000, for example, is that over a period of like a year? Or like, so if they're purchasing obviously one tire for that one time, but over the course of the year, it's over that $75,000 threshold over the course of a year, or is that how it's determined?
Depends on the contract, right? So one-off purchases, so when you're referring to the 75,000 threshold, just to be clear, that's the threshold amount under the NWPTA. So that's the regional agreement, and that's when I'm referring to lower threshold amounts. There are instances where there's a one-off. There's no specific period that's considered, but it's a period of a contract, right? So, if that's going to be something that is purchased over a year, or there's a rate established over a certain term, you need to be assessing it within that entire term. So one-offs can exist, but one-offs are one of the reasons why some of these rules have come into play, because it was, circumventing that open procurement process, just by having those one-offs exist with specific preferred vendors. So really it depends on the contract. If it is a one-off, for the most part, the risk might be low, but it may not be trade compliant if that's a consistent purchase that's happening over time.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And you were saying for the purpose of the notice of intent, you said it's also like more so for vendors, so they're involved in the procurement opportunity. Is that correct? Like, it's also for CFTA, the ensuring members' compliance, but it's also for vendors, right? So they can participate.
Absolutely. So it's absolutely for the vendors. It's to ensure that opportunities aren't being missed at a local level. I see that there's a question here from Valerie noting whether you have to annually file the notice of intention. It is an annual requirement, because what it is it requires you to note the period of time within a 1-year period that you would intend to participate. So it is absolutely an annual requirement. As I noted, right now, SAS tenders had given some feedback, just given the nature of the portal, that SARM could post on behalf of its membership, and that's what SARM has been doing. But in the next couple of weeks, we have some calls scheduled to clarify that. But for now, for the purpose of this presentation, in terms of a requirement under the legislation, it is an annual requirement for this notice of intention. And the reason, and as Ainsley, you mentioned, vendors need to have this opportunity to search out opportunities. And so, if it's not posted, they won't automatically be directed to the buying group site, right? So we want to be able to ensure that there's that connection there.
And so by being directed to the
absolutely important.
Yeah, and so by being directed to the group buying program site, they can then participate in our program. That's kind of how they would voluntarily work with us on that.
Exactly. So there's that notice out there, so they're aware of where to look for opportunities, right? And so that's why one of the reasons we also, as buying groups, will post these notices of intention is we don't want to create a situation where vendors are precluded from participating. Any sort of open procurement, we want them to be able to access. And so that's what the requirement is. If we get that feedback from the province that they're waiving this notice of intention, we'll absolutely notify you through SARM. But we're still waiting on that confirmation. We want to ensure that we're advising appropriately. So for the purpose of today, absolutely, it's an annual posting.
Great. I do have one more question I always get from members is, so what if a supplier isn't included on our SARM list? Like, and then that's something that they want to use. For example, I just had fire truck supplier that wasn't on our list. What do you suggest that members do?
Well, in those instances, then you'd be required to go to open procurement if there's a supplier not listed. That would be an example of limited tendering to go and buy just from a specific supplier that hadn't participated. That would be circumventing the rules. So then in those instances, you'd be required to conduct your own open procurement. And again, evaluation on that would not necessarily create, that supplier may not necessarily win out based on the evaluation criteria. So that's kind of that's a benefit that the member would have to consider, right? That's a risk for sure. If there's not going to be an open procurement process there, because you're going to hit the threshold amounts very easily with that purchase. So yeah, I absolutely would encourage, in those instances to consider whether it's worth it to go to your own open procurement.
Okay. And you can't just get like a quote from that vendor. You'd actually have to do a public RFP process.
Yeah, and again, value amounts that would hit threshold. So yeah, it would need to be a public open procurement process. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
No problem. So I'm not seeing any other questions here.
No. There was one that just came through here.
Okay.
Well, Adam just said, Council has asked about increasing the quantity of gravel to be crushed after initial tender has been awarded. Should we then have indicated the tender RFP document as a negotiation clause, or how should we deal with this kind of situation?
Yeah, that would be, if a certain quantity was specified, that's slightly problematic. However, this might fall within one of those exceptions where it might not be, you might not be hitting the threshold amount for that added quantity. So that would be my first thing is the cost of the same. The second would be, a negotiation clause within the contract too, specifying a certain term and not really specifying quantities might have been helpful in that instance. But it's worth it to take a look at the, your initial RFP document to see if there was a specific quantity noted there. And also take a look at the exceptions, I would say, with respect to that, because it might just be from a cost perspective, you might just be, you're clearly duplicating costs. So you may be able to get within an exception there. The threshold for having to post a public RFP under the regional legislation is 75,000 for goods and services. And I believe it's 125,000 for construction. I might be wrong on that. I would need to check the NWPTA. But for goods and services, it is 75,000. Under the CFTA, it's 105,700 for goods and services. And under CETA, which is the international treaty, I believe it's 250,000. So there's different threshold amounts, but the lowest one is the one I always recommend that municipalities consider when considering open procurement. And that's what we as a group will always do. We just assume we're going to hit those amounts, even though it's a voluntary program.
Great. I'm not sure if there's any other questions. I just wanted to note we are looking at developing like an FAQ. I've been doing that in other provinces as well for the trade program. So definitely keep your eye out for that because these are very common questions that come through, and that's a good way to assist members if there's a document that they can refer to. And otherwise, yeah, if there's no other questions, I think close it off, but we're here to help. Like, definitely reach out to Amanda or myself should you have any other questions related to procurement or trade compliance or how to use the program. Otherwise, yeah, thanks, Raman, for that great information. That was really informative. I think members learned a lot, so I appreciate everyone for.
Yeah, thank you for your attention, everyone.
Great, thank you.